Okay, 3 minutes passed. Mark, should we start?
Yep, go ahead. It takes me even longer with sharing screen to find the mute button, so apologies. Yep, please.
Okay, very warm welcome to all of you colleagues. Good afternoon, good morning, depending where you are. It's great to see so many familiar faces on the screen today and faces that have been part of this journey, which we are now in since roughly a year from the beginning, and some newcomers as well. So it's great to see so much interest. And of course, we invited you as the GPA steering group members, since you are sort of the prime customers and also the prime source of information to develop this concept further on how to green operations and how to replace diesel generators and in general fossil fuel powered infrastructure in our settlements. Next slide, please, Mark. Today we wanted to give you an overview about the work that has been produced by Energy MRC in the last roughly 6 months. And after this first welcome introduction, Mark will take you back to the beginning of this journey, explaining what we've done in the past as the first component with the legal framework beginning of this year, and now the financing and de-risking work will be then explained by Douglas from MRC, Energy MRC. Then we have a 10-minute Q&A session planned, so feel free to ask any additional questions. I guess many of you have seen the report, many of you were part of the establishment, the writing of the report, so also thank you for that from our side. Then we have a few suggestions for next steps, but we would also, and this is for me the prime goal for this call, we would like to get your feedback on the next steps and how we as the GPA coordination unit should support this further if you think that's useful. So that's the last bit with the questions to the audience. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We don't want to go into an introduction round because we already have 25 people on the call. That would take too long. Please add your information into the chat that everybody's aware of who's online. And before we go into the details, I would very much like to thank especially GIZ and Shell for supporting this work in the past from the beginning. GIZ is also on the call today, and I will also we will also talk about Shell in a later stage when we come to the next steps. So I think without further ado, let's dive into content.
Okay, yep. Everyone hear me? This is Mark, as many of you already know. Excuse as I try and manage the presentation, Zoom, and introduce people into the webinar as we go, so do bear with me. But I'll try and race through this because most of you are aware of this topic and have participated in this process so far as we go through. And as you know, there's been a strong desire from humanitarian organizations to switch away from the traditional dependence on fossil fuels to more sustainable solutions, such as solar panels. When colleagues have sought change within their own organizations, they faced systematic barriers that prevented them from doing so. So to identify practical ways to unlock the impasse, the GPA coordination unit, in partnership with GIZ, Shell, Mercy Corps, and NetHope, held a series of workshops in the spring of last year with UN colleagues, international NGOs, and the private sector. The outcome The outcome of these workshops was very clear. The preferred solution to transition away from diesel to more renewable supplies of electricity was through the use of PPAs and leasing agreements, and doing so switch from an electricity producer to purchasing electricity from a third party, such as an energy service company. But why? Well, the main reasons are that risk, responsibilities, warranties, guarantees, financing, operations, and maintenance are all transferred away from the humanitarian organisation to the energy service company. And in doing so, the energy service company's experience can bring existing know-how, lower operating costs, can deliver the project faster, and has an improved data management process, because data is money. And as well as these opportunities, it also triggers the skills transfers to local businesses and opens up livelihood opportunities to the local workforce. However, to date, there has been very little to no use of PPAs and lease agreements in the humanitarian space. And why is this? Well, there's two reasons. The first, the UN and the private sector speak different languages and have different risk profiles, which was delaying and preventing the agreement to contractual terms. And secondly, related to this, the private sector has difficulty in accepting the UN's contractual termination clause, which may be a low risk for the procurement of goods. It is of significant concern to the private sector when it's investing hundreds of thousands of dollars into solar plant that could become obsolete at the stroke of a pen after a few months of operation. As a result, the GPA coordination unit has worked with GIZ, Becker Butter Held, a German law firm, and the wider GPA community to develop contractual terms that balance between the risks and needs of the UN entities and the private sector with regards to agreeing contractual terms for PPAs and leasing agreements. In addition, the GPA coordination unit has worked with Shell and Energy MRC, a British energy consulting firm, and selected members of the GPA community to identify and develop a de-risking mechanism that could allow the UN to keep its contractual termination clause while providing the private sector with the financial security should the clause be triggered. In having completed both projects, we're now in a position to unlock the potential of PPAs and leasing agreements in displacement settings. And today, we will learn about the proposed de-risking mechanism. As mentioned, the project was supported financially and technically by Shell, with context and coordination activities provided by the GPA coordination unit, with the work being undertaken by Energy MRC. The consultant was tasked with examining the feasibility of de-risking PPAs and lease agreements with humanitarian agencies through the use of guarantee instruments and other such tools, and with a structured methodology. I'm not going to go through that in this moment in time, but it's there should you need it. So it gives me great pleasure now to hand over to Douglas to go through the recommendations of the work that he and his team have undertaken. Now, if anyone has any questions, please just write them in the chat box in the side here, and we can address those at the end of the presentation. So over to you, Douglas.
Thanks very much, Mark. So thanks for that introduction. Yeah, I'm just in this short slot, I'm going through the main recommendations that we made as part of the de-risking assignment. We started this, as Mark said, in about April, and we consulted with a lot of you between April and June. And since then, we've been taking feedback from various people as well. So the main recommendations are established here. The first one is to adopt a risk allocation in the template agreements, which the private sector more or less will recognise. And that's an extremely important point, because the extent to which the humanitarian agencies can assume risk, then you can expect lower pricing from the private sector, and the converse is also true. So the extent to which you try and pass risk to the private sector, you'll experience increased pricing or decreased participation in any auctions that you might run. So it's an extremely important point. And if you take that point on board, the assignment then becomes one of, well, how do you de-risk it for the humanitarian agency in order to recover some termination liability or exposure that you might have. So, as I say, the first recommendation is to incorporate a termination obligation or payment of termination payments in the event that you, as the off-taker, have to terminate the contract early. Okay, so that creates a liability for you, but it's our recommendation that these liabilities are written into the contracts, whether they're leases or whether they're long-term agreements. They should be firm obligations on you as the agency, as the off-taker. And as I say, the question then becomes, well, how do you mitigate against that liability? So one of the main solutions that we explore in the report is the establishment of an insurance facility. So as well as having in long-term agreement stroke lease the termination obligations, which other things being equal will attract the private sector there. So you will have participants in your auctions. The question comes, well, how can you mitigate that termination event if you are obliged to pay out? And what we are suggesting is that an insurance facility is established with a reputable insurance company, which would pay out to you, to the insurance, from the insurance company to the humanitarian agency in the event that termination is triggered. In the way that we understand is going to be a low probability event, but still, this is one of the main mitigants that we have in our armory. So that's one of the central recommendations that we put forward. And as part of the report, those who've made it to the annex, you'll have seen that there has been some quantification of what that could mean for you, both from an aggregate insurance pot point of view and in individual sort of fees. In any event, how would it look? Could we go to the next slide, please, Mark? So this is a schematic that many of you will have seen. I've discussed the features of this with many of you in the course of the assignment. We see centrally administered insurance facility established by a reputable insurer, funded initially by donor funding. And the reason for that is that well, we believe the private sector will be able to be attracted to this in due course, but certainly initially, when we're in the early stages of this journey, when the risks are still being understood, then we think this is this is probably only going to be achievable from a risk perspective through donor funding. So putting in donor funds initially in a central facility. And the idea would be that the humanitarian agency signs up to this with the insurance company. It is sitting underneath the long-term agreement. So in other words, the ESCO, the energy service company, which we're showing here, is party to the long-term agreement, is party to the lease or the PPA. The ESCO is more or less indifferent as to how you pay for your obligations, should they be triggered. So they don't see any of the insurance paraphernalia or commercial architecture. That's primarily between yourselves and the insurance company. But this is, a very simple diagram of how this would work. We've made the point that there will be a materiality threshold here for commercial companies to be involved and commercial insurers to be involved. So to the extent that things like property insurance can be bundled with this, that will sweeten the pot for the private sector becoming involved in this kind of scheme. Okay. So another part of this, and there are various different ways that these mechanisms can work together, but what we're also suggesting is that you look at how this works in the larger scale solar industry, and certainly it is market standard for the off-taker where there's any suggestion of credit risk, and certainly here where there's a suggestion of termination risk, that there's a commercial security put in place. What that security does is give the seller, the ESCO under the contract, some comfort that should termination be triggered, or should there be some sort of credit interruption, then there's a liquid facility that they can draw down again. And that's an extremely powerful mitigant for them. And again, the issue here is because you're de-risking it for the private sector, you would expect, other things being equal, to see lower prices if you provide instruments such as these. So it's not the case that although there's a fee to be paid through either the use of a letter of credit or through the use of the ESCO, it's not the case that it's a one-way financial transfer. The way that the private sector look at these transactions is fairly sophisticated from a risk point of view. And as I said before, the extent to which you can assume some of the risk and de-risk it, then you will see that in the form of beneficial prices or beneficial offers. Okay. Okay, I've talked about commercial securities here. Another thing that we investigate in the report is essentially a liquidity facility. And this can sit alongside insurance, it can sit alongside commercial securities, or it can pretty much be standalone. And I noticed that UNHCR and Nicole, they are certainly going down this route where there's essentially a central fund which is being used to underwrite any potential termination liabilities and a few other things. But in any event, I mean, it's a fairly simple sort of instrument to implement. But as I say, it can sit alongside insurance. So to the extent that you had an insurance policy which paid out for insurable risks, then this could be a separate fund which backstopped that and paid any residual risks that couldn't be insured against. And there will be some of them. Okay. Now, in that liquidity facility, you could have on a institution by institution basis, and that would be relatively easy to set up and to establish. It doesn't need any sort of separate legal form or anything like that. Or if you did want to take advantage of, I guess, portfolio effects, of aggregation effects, you could try and set something up between agencies. That will be more complex to do. You'll have to have rules around that. You'll have to have some legal architecture around that, but it is certainly doable. Next slide, please, Mark. Just quickly going back to the commercial securities. Now, the commercial securities are something that when you're going out to bidders need to know about these to be able to incorporate the de-risking effect into their prices that they pass to you. You have the choice of either doing this as an escrow account, which is basically a bank account with some period of time of payments that the bidders can draw down in the event of a termination or a credit interruption, or you can do it through a letter of credit as well, which is very sort of common commercially. It may be challenging for some agencies to do that. That's why we've put both potential de-risking mechanisms in here. And again, this sits alongside the PPA and the lease with the firm obligation on termination. And there are some other ideas in the report that we're setting out. For example, we believe there should be reasonable endeavours, obligations for any redeployment of facilities in the event of termination. And that's quite an important point, because some structures that ESCOs, the energy service companies, may be able to provide for you might be modular. You might be able to put in a modular system in place, in which case there could be a potential for redeployment, either by the ESCO or indeed by the agency. So I think the contractual arrangements have to take that into account, and to the extent that that is possible within your contractual and technical framework, then that would reduce your termination obligations as well. Okay, Mark, next slide, please. We put together some implementation issues. We discussed these in the report. The long-term agreement, securities, insurance provisions are fairly interlinked. So to the extent that this can be achieved, we would suggest that these are done at the same time, or addressed at the same time, because ultimately they'll be referencing the same projects, they'll be referencing the same contractual documentation. The documentation between the bidders stroke ESCOs and yourselves will be the security and any long-term agreement. As I mentioned before, the insurance provisions would be between yourself and an insurance company, and it wouldn't necessarily be apparent to the ESCOs, because one of the features of this particular risk allocation is that the energy service companies should be comfortable with the credit risk and the credit profiles of agencies as off-takers. So to the extent that you have obligations in your contractual provisions between the ESCO and yourselves, the ESCOs will not need to look beyond that for where the money is coming from. Okay. Commercial securities are fairly simple, and as I mentioned, you can do that as a letter of credit, which is just priced up at a percentage in excess of normal interest rate with a bank, or if you establish a escrow facility, again, it's just like opening up a bank account. The insurance, on the other hand, will take a little bit more time to design. Because this was fairly conceptual, we will need to work with specific contracts. We will need to develop the contracts. So the lease and PPA documents will have to be refined. Then the insurances will need to be discussed with insurance companies and term sheets produced, and so on and so forth. We think that process is going to take a number of months. So there are options to, for example, implement the insurance in parallel with any other mechanisms that you put in place. By that I mean you could, for example, set aside donor funding prior to the insurance pot being established, and simply use it as a liquidity facility until such a time that the insurance pot is established, and then it rolls into an insurance. For various permutations you can look at. I think that's more or less where I am. Happy to take questions on this. I think that's the next stage. Thanks.
Exactly. Thanks very much, Douglas. And colleague, floor is yours. Open for questions.
I hope I kept to time, did I?
Very good. We still have 15 minutes for questions. It's good.
Okay. Stunned silence.
Thomas, we have a raised hand from Maurizio.
Yes, please, Maurizio.
Hi all. Thank you for the this comprehensive presentation. First of all, I'm just curious and wondering if you have already done some practical arrangement with some, I don't know, UN agency or banks or whatever, some practical example to share over.
Well, we have been supporting UNHCR in the establishment of their fund, their termination fund, and that work. I think, I'm not sure if Irene is on the call. Irene's son is on the call. That work is more or less completed, as far as I'm aware. So that's a practical example of some work we have done with an agency in parallel with this work.
And Maurizio, to add on this, one concrete suggestion for a next step from our side would be to develop a pilot, but that's something Mark will talk about in the next agenda point.
Douglas, do you want to mention about the work you've been doing with Munich Re on this as well?
Yes, well, I mean, we have been consulting as part of this project with Munich Re, which is an insurance company. And our suggestion is to try and work with their consulting arm, who have developed a fairly similar product for larger scale solar. Okay, so they've been working in the larger scale solar field, trying to develop a similar product for this. Other exemplars that you can draw on, there's a KfW product which underwrites commercial securities, again in the larger scale solar sub-Saharan African market. So there are various exemplars that we sort of pull out in the report. And apart from that, as a company, you know, we help with procurement of you know, solar PV type arrays. Was that helpful?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, thank you.
And after this call, if anybody wants a deeper dive on any of this, you know, I'm happy to schedule something, if that's more important for the individual circumstances of any agency.
Okay, thanks.
I see you raising hand from Matteo. Matteo, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks for this presentation. I mean, we have been discussing quite a bit on this instrument with Douglas, but I think it would be useful if you could share with us also what would be the advantage or disadvantage of the two instruments presented, and comparing the two instruments in terms of, you know, what would be sort of the easiest instrument to implement in the short term.
Sure, I think easiest in the short term. Well, I think the contractual revisions have to take place anyway. So you need to do those contractual revisions and adopt a risk allocation which is appropriate, and that isn't difficult to do because there are plenty of examples in solar contracts, whether they're leases, EPCs, or PPAs. So that's straightforward. That has to be done. In terms of ease of implementation, whether you're talking about a liquidity facility versus insurance policy, it's certainly easier to establish the liquidity facility. All you really need is donor funding and rules around disbursement, essentially. So that's extremely straightforward. On the other hand, an insurance policy is going to be more difficult and I guess tricky to set up initially, but the benefits of having the insurance policy set up, and to the extent that it works as we envisage it, the major advantage is that you have the potential to have private sector funding in there eventually, and you know, public donor funding to be retired ultimately, and you don't really have that in the other instruments. So from my perspective, I think although it's more complex to establish initially, it's an opportunity that you should look at seriously at the start.
Can I jump into this? Douglas, we've discussed this also a little bit. Can you elaborate a little bit, maybe pros and cons and difficulties in setting up a joint insurance mechanism or a mechanism for each individual agency?
Liquidity facility rather than insurance. I mean, the insurance has to be central. Yeah, the liquidity facility, you know, if you are establishing a liquidity facility between agencies, obviously it has to have a separate legal personality. You have to have trustees put in place. It may be that if the participants are UN agencies, and this is something that Matteo commented on when he read the report a couple of months ago. You know, there is a central. Matteo, remind the group perhaps of the central fund administrator for the UN who could potentially take on the role of a common trustee to this. I think it becomes more complicated when you have agencies that are not in the UN family. I know that some agencies would not want to do anything apart from have their own independent facilities. So it's not suitable for all agencies, I think, never mind the complexities of setting it up.
Thank you. There's a question or a comment from Marianne from GRZ. Would it be possible to say a few words on tariff sculpting and modularization, as they could be short-term measures, if I understood correctly from the report?
Modularization, I think, is an extremely good idea for very, very short-term sort of PPAs. And I know Marianne's team was very keen on tariff sculpting as well. The idea for tariff sculpting, for those that aren't familiar with it, is that you recover more upfront or early in the contract as a risk mitigant against the contract being terminated. I think that, I mean, personally, I think it is worthwhile in some cases. It won't suit every private sector investor though, because implicit in having a tariff sculpting situation is that, you know, it's probably necessary because there isn't termination provisions underwriting the contract, and that going down that route will immediately cut out quite a few potential energy service companies who just can't invest on that basis. So in other words, you're asking the energy service company to take a bet or take some view of the risk of early termination, and that will come with a price. So it may be suitable in some cases, but I mean, personally, I would keep to what we have recommended here. Modularization is something else. Modularization is, you know, it's great to the extent that you can modularize facilities, and some can, some can't be. So I'm not sure if that helps.
Marianne, do you have anything to add or follow-up question on this?
No, that's fine. Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you. Any other question?
Hey, Douglas. This is Irene from UNHCR. Sorry if I missed it in the presentation. But what is the approximate or your expectation? It could be very rough at this sense of the cost to the purchasing agency of an insurance product?
Well, it's usually a percentage of the capital costs. So it's usually Normally insurance policies like this are going to be single-digit percentages of capital cost, you know, smeared across the existing participants. So, you know, there are, the more participants there are, and depending on the characteristics of the technical solutions, you know, you can take a guess. We do have some numbers in the annex of the report, but I would say, you know, they have to be reworked in the context of real world problems. But I mean, if you're considering a 5% increment in capital costs, you know, you can adjust the term of your contract accordingly to account for that increment in cost. So it's not a significant increment if you're considering the overall capital costs of the project, and it should be a relative short increase in term for the same capacity payments or off-taker payments.
Got it. Okay, so it's mid-single digit, most likely, as a percentage of the capital cost.
Yeah, I mean, the smaller projects, it's going to be more. Larger projects, it's going to be less. You know, it depends on the project. It really does.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Douglas. Back to you, Mark, for the next steps.
Yep. So thank you. What we want to do now is move away from theory to a proof of concept. You know, working with humanitarian partners of 1 or 2 countries where we use donor funds to act as a virtual insurance pot as additional work is undertaken with the insurance specialists on the data that becomes available. In addition, as Douglas has pointed out, we'd also like to work to align the standard contractual terms to the de-risking mechanism and support the development of procurement processes. Move away from the purchase of diesel and generators to the purchase of electricity through PPAs and leasing agreements. I suppose what we're really looking at also is, you know, this is always seen as a first step. This is the low-hanging fruit of addressing, you know, renewable energy to UN agencies, with the long-term view of how do we use this to actually increase energy access where it really matters to the displaced, the local host community, and the activities that are happening in the displacement settings. So here, what we're doing is, you know, trying to use the lessons learned to see if we can actually use the same approach where there is a need for annual contract breaks that sort of suit the budgeting projects that are on an annual basis within these displacement settings. But also, you know, how can we use, where geographically appropriate to do so, use the UN as an anchor client and using the sort of the bulk of the investment in that system to then further fund, you know, an extension to the system to roll out for productive use and household energy usage in neighbouring areas. And I would just like to also reach out to Marianne from GIZ at this juncture, because I believe that GIZ have some additional services that they would like to offer around this topic. So quickly over to you, Marianne.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, so just a few words from my side is that we are looking forward to collaborate further with the GPA coordination unit on the next steps, particularly on 2 aspects. First is on the developing of lease and PPA bidding documents suitable for humanitarian settings. And secondly, we think it will be helpful following this presentation to have existing contractual documents aligned to the proposed de-risking mechanisms. And this is also something that we are also keenly looking forward to supporting the GPA coordination unit as well. So yeah, thank you, Mark.
Great, thanks, Marianne, and thank you for the continued support in this topic from GIZ. And Thomas, I think that sort of leads in really back over to you. in our involvement.
Yeah, thank you. Before I go in, any questions on the proposed next steps? Just clarification questions. No, it doesn't seem the case. So our, as you heard, we have additional support, or we can gain additional support from GIZ. We can also, I'm sure also Douglas and Energy MRC would be willing to work on this or continue working on this in the future, as if there's funding available for that. So we stand ready to work with all of you on this further. But of course, we are only from the GPA coordination unit, the service provider, and we can try to work and develop this further with you. But at the end, the customer are the UN agencies as well as some NGOs. So at the end, it would be you who would need to sign the contract and also accept the potential insurance package and liquidity mechanism as it was suggested in this contract. So in other words, we are happy and willing to continue working with you on this, but we would need obviously a kind of mandate from your side. And that's why we want to use the remaining 10 minutes to discuss a little bit what would it mean from your side. Would you like us to continue working on this? And we suggested to you 3 questions via email, and we're doing this with this wonderful polling system here at Zoom. And then we can have a bit of a chat around this. So the first question would be, would your organization be willing to invest in the development and the use of this de-risking tool? Of course, it doesn't make sense to continue investing in this if you can already see that your organization won't participate in this in the future. So colleagues, please submit your answer to these 2 questions, to this question, either yes or no. Actually, I just realized we can click both, yes and no, Mark. Okay, Mark, can we pull it up already?
Do you see it now?
Yeah. Hope everybody can see this. 75% are saying they would like to continue investing in this and using it as well. Does anyone from the 30% that are not going to use it would like to respond to this, or would like to explain anything?
Can I explain? I don't know if you want it through the chat.
No, please go ahead, Tina.
Yeah, I was one of the no's, and I say this openly. It's only for us a matter of time that right now, because we would need somebody from procurement, and they're severely understaffed, so we would not be able in this moment to do anything concrete. Mm-hmm. But definitely if something comes up maybe in the future next year, this may change. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, since there was only yes or no or not much else, that's why I said no.
Mm-hmm. Good, thanks, Tina.
Yeah.
Maurizio?
Yeah, I think Tina just spoke with my own words. It's very same. I mean, she just said what I would have said, so.
Mm-hmm. So for you, if I understand correctly, it's a question of capacity, especially in the procurement section.
In this moment, yeah, exactly. So okay. I'm very open to fund this, but to be honest, there is also another small thing, which is that for the moment, the PPA is probably not so interesting for companies, because our system right now are only focused on our own premises. So this might be too small for a PPA.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, but this is something that I think it's a second moment that can be seen over.
Maurizio, do you think the bottleneck could be the size of the system, or what do you think will hold the companies back to use PPAs?
Oh, well, yeah, the size may be, and of course, because we are in the middle of nowhere, there could be some issues with local power providers. There could be issues with the length of the contract, but those are what's the base of our discussion were. So we just need to test the market with those because to be honest, we didn't test the market actually, the appetite for the market on our premises.
Yeah.
Thanks, over.
Thanks, Maurizio. Okay, Mark, second question, please. Okay, obviously the question, should we continue driving this sort of on your behalf with your strong collaboration? Please let us know what you think. And be honest, be open. We are here to help. And we also know our limits. So please answer this question. Can you pull it up, Mark? Okay. That sounds like a lot of work for us then. Thank you. Thank you for all your trust in our capabilities. Third question, Mark. And then this is about next steps. Where can we organize a proof of concept? And would you be interested as your organization? Mark, can you pull it up? Wow, that's also quite good. 90% would saying, actually something is not matching up here, Mark. 90% saying yes, 30% saying no. Okay, two questions on this. First, would anybody like to say something from the no fraction? Probably it's also a matter of capacity, but just to discuss this a little bit. Okay.
Well, I think on this one, I and at least one other UNHCR colleague didn't vote. We just abstained because it's really hard to tell. This really would depend on the parameters of the de-risking tool in question. By the time it's negotiated, I'm sure it would go through additional changes. And just given the fact that there's also a range of potential projects and, in terms of size and location and different characteristics, I think we just have to look at the details as this gets further.
Yeah, very understandable, right? Thank you. Anybody else? Okay.
If I can add just I think Irene already said it, but another thing is like depend also inside the organization, the department that is thinking about this, the risking. Because for example, what I was thinking listening to the presentation seems like, of course, big scales are better also for the increasing capital and the cost, and also it's more attractive to an insurance or commercial security, what we say. This, if you are starting to consider the organization compound, for example, then it's something that becomes easier in my mind at least. But if you are considering camps and refugees or people of concern starting paying, or how the mechanism could be for such a vulnerable contest, mainly on if we know that, for example, the organization will be able to pay back the leasing mechanism, for example, or the PPA. But what about if we put this idea in a camp and then it's smaller? So I was just thinking about all of this, and then, as Irene says, difficult coming with a proof of concept, and I'm not sure that my section, for example, that is for refugees, then will be interested as much as, for example, another department that might want to greening the compounds and so. So this was my question. Yeah, I put yes or no, so I am one of them. So next time put yes, no, maybe.
Yes. Diana, again, it's a very good point, and it's something that Mark mentioned already. From the outset, we were thinking, how can we use this model also to serve the vulnerable population we're talking about, right? So we see the proof of concept in a first stage targeting the offices, targeting the own compounds of the UN. But certainly in the next step, we would like to see and explore how this could be used in camp settings or settlements as well. Maybe Richard, would you like to give us an update where you stand from UNICEF side? Talking about next steps?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Sorry, putting you on the spot.
No, not at all. So I was just talking to an old friend on so we're super keen and navigating our bureaucracy. I think that's the sort of fairest way to put it. But we did have a good conversation in terms of East and Southern Africa a couple of days ago, who are quite keen and interested in piloting this model there. So we're keen to pursue, we're also keen to work in partnership with others. We're moving quite well in terms of the procurement process for getting other energy providers on board. So we're making some headway, not as fast as we would like, but we're moving and we're keen to participate and keen to partner as well.
Thanks, Richard. And then for the benefit of all, also UNICEF is trying the first phase with the offices, with their own offices, and in a next stage, they would like to extend this to the displaced population and such. And we are in discussion with another colleague of Richard, who is working on this in particular.
Exactly.
Okay, I think that brings us to the end. For those who are interested in piloting this, can you give us 3 countries that spring to your mind that are interesting for this first pilot, for this proof of concept? Maurizio already asked, thanks for putting this into the chat as well. Maurizio asked, can we find common premises for this? That's an interesting idea, and it's something we ventilated in previous discussions as well. So it's certainly something, Maurizio, we will think about. Okay. Thank you, colleagues.
Sorry, Thomas, there's a couple of countries coming through in the chat.
Yes, I think everybody can see it. That's why I'm
okay. All right.
Sorry, I didn't do this. Uganda was mentioned a couple of times. Eastern Africa. Yeah. Thank you for all your suggestions. We will have another webinar like this on Thursday, this time for the wider audience, because as you know, we had from the outset also invited many friends and colleagues from the NGO sector and other partners from academia and so on were interested in this topic as well. So this session was for steering group members. We went into a few more details than we will do on Thursday. So if you feel it's useful for other colleagues to attend on Thursday, feel free to send a communication, send the invite further. Otherwise, for you, no need to attend Thursday's meeting, and we will get back to all of you for concrete next steps. We will discuss this now within the team, together also with UNICEF, together with GSZ and Shell, and get back to you with some concrete suggestions. Any last points from your side? Gloria, thank you for the idea of using SDG fund. That's also a good idea. Okay, thank you. Then we are finishing on time. Happy rest of the day to all of you, and looking forward to talking to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Tina. Ciao.
Bye.
And stop recording, please, Mark.